Peter B. Collins, News and Comment. It's Monday, May 18th, 2020. And I want to report to listeners I had some computer trouble today. My main computer froze. It set me back about an hour, and it erased all of the hyperlinks that I collect so that I can share my source material or sources of the articles that I comment on with you. And I won't have time to restore all that today, but you have my apology, and hopefully I will have better luck with my computers tomorrow. So, very interesting pattern. In the last 24 hours, 3 officials of the Trump administration, 2 high-ranking, 1 not so much, have contradicted their fearless leader. And they are Bill Barr, who plays Attorney General, and usually is seen as obsequiously misusing his post to defend Mr. Trump. Then there is the chairman of the Federal Reserve, who faces all kinds of criticism from Trump and backseat driving over what the interest rate level should be, who appeared on 60 Minutes. And then there is Rick Bright, the whistleblower who testified before Congress last week about the internal failings of the Health and Human Services Department when they first learned of the impending pandemic at the end of January. One of the 3 is the subject of a bitter and relentless Twitter shitstorm from our dear tweeter. And you can guess which one as I lay out this pattern. So Bill Barr, the Attorney General, surprised me today by dismissing Trump's attempts to rebrand the Russia investigation as a criminal plot engineered by Barack Obama, saying that he expected no charges against either Obama or former Vice President Joe Biden as a result of the investigation into the Russiagate investigation's early stages. Now, this is a surprise, but keep in mind that Bill Barr is a slippery-tongued so-and-so. Quote, "As long as I'm Attorney General, the criminal justice system will not be used for partisan political ends." Now, ordinarily, I'd say that's hilarious. He talked about John Durham, the federal prosecutor who he has detailed to conduct this investigation. And as you know, I believe that the Russiagate narrative has completely crumbled. It's disintegrated because we now have direct testimony under oath that the leader of CrowdStrike, Sean Henry, had to admit to questioning from Adam Schiff and other members of the House Intelligence Committee in 2017 and 2018 that, well, we don't actually have any evidence that it was Russia that hacked the DNC. We just firmly believe it. So based on that, and then last week's dramatic unveiling of the people who unmasked Mike Flynn's identity after the transcript of his surveilled phone call with the Russian ambassador was declassified and released, what I saw was a pattern here. That this is the concerted effort of Team Trump to not only expose what they think was a whole ginned-up scandal, but to get a little blood from the other side. So we have a few more quotes here from Bill Barr. Quote, "We saw 2 different standards of justice emerge. One that applies to President Trump and his associates, and the other that applied to everybody else. We can't allow this to ever happen again." But he's also called the Russia investigation a grave injustice, unprecedented in American history, that reflected increasing attempts to use the criminal justice system as a political weapon. So we can't take either of these statements as credible. But I do find it interesting that he's directly contradicting his boss. And to my knowledge, I refuse to follow Trump on Twitter, but from media accounts, There has been no blowback so far. Now, it's only been a few hours since Barr uttered those comments. And let's see here in the Washington Post, their coverage. Same quote there. Here's a little different quote. The legal tactic has been to gin up allegations of criminality by one's political opponents based on the flimsiest of legal theories. As to President Obama and Vice President Biden, whatever their level of involvement, based on the information I have today, I don't expect Mr. Durham's work will lead to a criminal investigation of either man. Our concern over potential criminality is focused on others. Now, we need to hasten to add here that Barr is engaging in the violation of a long-standing practice of the Justice Department. We don't talk about ongoing investigations. And Barr has teased that Durham is uncovering dastardly deeds of dark dimensions. Yeah, I didn't write that down. That alliteration just came right off the top of my head. So it's fascinating. And I maintain my position that the FBI agents who launched Crossfire Hurricane on the last day of July in 2016, first targeting Carter Page, then they opened Crossfire Razor, focusing on Mike Flynn, and I think that guy's dirty. But when they ultimately used the Crossfire Razor case to then say that the Kislyak phone call was problematic, send agents over to talk to him. And as I've reported, they tipped him off that they were coming and what it was about. And we do get varying accounts about whether the FBI agents who went to the White House to talk to Flynn approached him in a friendly and disarming manner. But we're told that Andy McCabe, the number 2 at the FBI, personally called Flynn, set up the appointment. And that when Flynn asked what it was about, he said, yeah, it's about the phone call. So I can't say that I have clear details on the exact sequence of events there. So the other person who contradicted Trump without naming him was the Federal Reserve Chairman, Jerome Powell. And he showed some real cojones. Interviewed on 60 Minutes, he said, look, the economic recovery has to follow containment of the virus. As long as we have a health crisis and a potential second wave in the fall, we can't just, I'm not quoting him here, but he said things to the effect that we can't expect the economy to regain strength. And he openly dissed McConnell and Trump and others who are, as Trump said, in no hurry to take up the latest $3 billion relief package, and I have problems with parts of it, that was voted out on a Democratic Party line from the House on Friday. And Pelosi has said, it's just the blueprint for negotiations. She has signaled that she doesn't expect to get everything that's in that package. But when the Senate leader and the White House just say, meh, and then you have the chair of the Federal Reserve saying, look, we've lowered interest rates to the point that this is essentially free money. And it is needed. And he also said, despite his almost unlimited powers to shovel money at banks and corporate America, that it is average people, families with household incomes under $50,000 who really need help from the government right now. So he came off. I mean, he's still a dyed-in-the-wool capitalist, make no mistake about that. But he came across with a position that's quite different from Trump and the Republican main line. And as we watched it, I turned to Kathy and I said, he talked about how unemployment will continue to go up. And I said, I kind of expect he's going to be in the unemployment line tomorrow morning. But as of my Deadline here today, he's still got the job. Now, the guy who's in the crosshairs of our tweeter-in-chief is Rick Bright. And I watched some of his testimony before the Senate committee. Oh, no, it was a House subcommittee on Thursday. Anna Eshoo of Silicon Valley was chairing that proceeding. And Bright comes across as, not a partisan fighter, but as somebody who was appalled that the partisans he reported to at Health and Human Services wouldn't listen to him on two key points. At the end of January, he sounded the alarm, hey, we got a pandemic coming, and we don't even have enough face masks in the United States and other PPE. And his second violation was that he sounded the alarm that when Trump was promoting hydroxychloroquine as the miracle cure, and he said that he, was forced to sign documents to put massive amounts of this drug into circulation, that he tried to limit the distribution to hospital settings to avoid having, just Joe Public buy it at his local pharmacy and take doses hoping to beat the virus. And the issue is what we have seen borne out, that the side effects, including death, the risk to people with pre-existing heart conditions, are really severe. And so Trump continues to attack him as a disgruntled employee, and I don't think Rick Bright presents that way. Here's a partial tweet. Somebody, I guess he's saying that it's a series of tweets, and I don't have the oh, here it is. No, I don't have the first one. So the second one starts, spews lies. I think he's referring to Bright, Dr. Bright. 60 Minutes report was incorrect, which they couldn't care less about. Fake news. I don't know this guy, never met him, but don't like what I see. Now, keep in mind, he didn't know Mike Cohen. Almost never met him after Cohen turned on him. Anyway, how can a creep like this show up to work tomorrow? Well, he's not going to work because they shifted him to another job, and he doesn't report until the end of May. Then the next tweet, this whole whistleblower racket needs to be looked at very closely. It is causing great injustice and harm. I hope you're listening, Senator Susan Collins. She's up for re-election. She, of course, is the Republican from Maine, and she postures as the thinking, feeling Republican who's not a full Trumper, but she votes along party lines every time. Anyway, he's trying to shame her into backing off on whistleblower protections. And then he goes sideways to, show that he rubs shoulders with the captains and captainesses of American industry. I hope that Sherry Redstone will take a look at her poorly performing gang. She knows how to make things right. Well, Sherry had this big fight with her father before he died, and she now controls the CBS Viacom empire. And theoretically, she could do something to the 60 Minutes people if she really wanted to. So this pattern is clear. And on Friday night, Trump fired the Inspector General over at the State Department. We'll get to that story in a minute, but I have another whistleblower for you, this one coming out of Stanford University. And Stanford's professor John, I don't know if he says it Ioannidis or Ioannidis, Ioannidis. He published a report, which was a preliminary report on a study that estimated that, zillions more people have had and survived the coronavirus than was previously known. And his interim report was widely denounced by other scientists, saying that it was a lot of speculation and that the antibodies tests that it was based on were unreliable. So now we learn, through this whistleblower, the accusation that this study was funded in part by the founder of JetBlue Airways, David Neeleman. Now, that's somebody who has a vested interest in seeing the restrictions lifted and the recovery of the travel industry. And JetBlue is a younger airline. I imagine it's carrying a huge debt load, and he is looking for relief without being quite as annoying as Elon Musk. So this came out April 17th, and now we have a little bit of the backstory to it. So, over at the State Department, we are learning that the Inspector General who Trump fired on Friday night has been investigating Mike Pompeo, who was the CIA director and is now in his second full year as Secretary of State, that he made the controversial decision to approve Saudi arms sales last year, and that Steve Linick, the IG who was dismissed, was also investigating the Secretary of State for making a department staffer run personal errands for him and his wife, including walking the dog. Now, I don't really care about that. It's not as egregious as Scott Pruitt's security team as the EPA director and his chartered jets and all that. But the real issue for me is that Mike Pompeo has engaged in a deep alliance, some would say conspiracy, with a company called Raytheon. And to its credit, the New York Times, without knowing the dimensions of the IG operations' latest work at the State Department, published a barrel of ink with the story leading on the front page Sunday, showing how Raytheon, with a whole lot of help from Trump's trade advisor Peter Navarro, has basically bulldozed Senate opposition to the sale of primarily Raytheon products to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia for use in its ongoing and bloody war in Yemen. And what this details is that Raytheon, and you probably know that Mark Esper, who is now the Secretary of Defense, was the Vice President for Public Affairs. He was the chief flack at Raytheon before he joined the administration. And his boss, whose name is Kennedy, I think I have it highlighted here, Thomas Kennedy, he was the CEO and he's now the executive chairman of this, and I believe they're the number 3 arms manufacturer, we call them defense contractors, in the U.S. orbit today. So they went after Mike Lee. They forced Rex Tillerson, who was spent a year as Secretary of State before Pompeo was shoved in there and he was shoved out. Mike Lee, the senator from Utah. Bob Corker, the former senator from Tennessee. And Bob Menendez, who has his own corruption issues, and he's a senator from New Jersey. All of those people resisted the expansion of sales to Raytheon, by Raytheon to Saudi Arabia, particularly after the assassination of Khashoggi at the Saudi embassy in Istanbul. And so I give the Times credit for exposing the incredible influence that Raytheon holds in the Trump administration and how they are able, with the help of Peter Navarro, who says his only thing is trade. He's just trying to sell shit, and Raytheon makes shit. It's shit that kills people, but, you know, it's American-made shit. I'm sorry for my language, but that's the best way I can describe this atrocious pattern. President Xi Jinping of China, who, by the way, last spoke to Trump in March, and they've been alternating between silence and public attacks on each other. He has trumped Trump, who, of course, withdrew $500 million in support to the World Health Organization, which is far from perfect and doesn't really have the investigative powers that Trump imagines it does. It relies on member nations to tell it stuff, and then it's more of a coordinating body, in my view. The other part of it is the man who runs it has his own dark history in his past. So that said, to try to cripple what is the only international body during a time of pandemic is a pretty ugly move by the United States. And this is a bit of an increase by China. Last year, they chipped in only $43 million to the WHO, compared to this commitment of $2 billion today. And at Mint Press News, Alan McLeod has a great report today showing that the demonization of China, similar to the way Russia has been made to appear more sinister to Americans in the last few years, that public opinion polls show just 3 years ago, Americans had a neutral view of China. 9 years ago, it was strongly favorable. Today, the same polls show that 66% of Americans dislike China, with only 26% holding a positive opinion of the country. Over 4 in 5 essentially support a full-scale economic war with Beijing. And as you know, this has been part of the strategy to blame China for the China virus, the Wuhan virus. And I still say it's an open question about whether it was made in a lab and leaked by one party or another, accidentally or on purpose. I have not seen enough evidence to prove one theory or another. But a new report from the Financial Times, quoted here in Mint Press, details how top brass in Washington are strategizing a new Cold War with China, describing it less as World War III and more as kicking each other under the table. Well, I don't consider that helpful in any event. And not only do we need China for masks and PPE, I just think that it's unhealthy to move into a Cold War footing. And I don't approve of China as a system. I don't approve of their violations of human rights. It is an authoritarian state. But no matter what I think, I don't think they're about to change. And our friend Pepe Escobar writes eloquently about their long-term plans, their determination. And I don't think we should take it lightly or be trifling with China. So today the stock market shot up 900 points. And look what it was based on. Findings from a drug maker, Moderna. And I don't want to dash anybody's hopes that there's going to be a vaccine or a treatment for COVID-19 sometime soon. I'd love to see that. I have my issues with vaccines and how that will be rolled out and who will profit from it. The new guy that Trump appointed to, Operation Warp Speed, is totally corrupted with the big pharma in this country. And so even if you entirely trust vaccines, which I don't, you can't trust these people to have the public interest as their first priority. So anyway, Moderna makes this announcement that the first coronavirus vaccine to be tested in people appears to be safe and able to stimulate an immune response against the virus. Okay, that's encouraging. So what's this based on? Results from 8 people who each received 2 doses of the experimental vaccine starting in March. Okay, well, let's just go with the flow, all right? Let's be hopeful and positive and say, oh, this is great news. We're getting these troubling reports of people who are having a second bout, not of testing positive, but of coming down with the disease, being actively infected with symptoms. I told you last week about the African-American woman in Victorville, California, 60-some years old. She was hospitalized and then released, declared cured from her first bout, and now she is back in the hospital. I don't know enough about her case, and I don't think it's public to declare that, they never really got rid of it the first time. That's a possibility. But now we have a group of sailors on the aircraft carrier Theodore Roosevelt who were reported to be suffering from the illness when they were taken ashore in Guam, and that now they've not only tested positive, but they actively have the infection for a second time. And this undermines the coronavirus studies that were behind these happy estimates that came out of Stanford in April. And so I don't oppose the stock market going up. A lot of people like me have taken a hit from the decline in the market, but I don't think any of this is permanent. And the current state of the market is largely because, as Fed Chairman Powell admitted last night, they've just thrown unlimited resources to prop up the market. And I don't think it particularly has staying power. Every day I like to pause to mention the Peter B. Collins Podcast Community Fund. We have raised a nice little bundle of money to pass out in $100 grants. I'm again inviting listeners to submit a request, or if you know people who could use $100 to cover the gap in their expenses versus income right now. Maybe they've been promised an unemployment check and it hasn't arrived. I can tell you here in California, when self-employed people like me were permitted to apply, it took exactly 1 week for the first round of payments to arrive. So the system here in California, at least in this round, there may have been snags earlier, but it appears to, just from my point of view and the people I know, to be working very well. But I know it's not the case in other states. And last week we sent $100 to a fellow in Columbus, Ohio, and I'd be happy to take a look at your grant request. We haven't turned one down yet. Just email peter@peterbcollins.com. And give me a little reason why you need $100, and I'd love to send a payment to you either via PayPal or we'll put a check in the U.S. mail. So here are your tax dollars at work, or not. One of the funds controlled by Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, the former foreclosure king in Southern California, well, there's a $500 billion fund created by the CARES Act. And they say almost none of the money has gone out, even to the airlines, right? They were first in line. And as you know, I think that they don't deserve money after squandering tax cuts and profits from those nasty baggage fees on stock buybacks to enrich the top executives. But if the CARES Act said they were going to get some money, it seems to me they ought to get follow-through from the Treasury Department. So that is being reported today, and it's been exposed by the Congressional Oversight Commission. And I want to make sure that this is clear, because a few weeks back, I confused one of these oversight bodies with another. And Donna Shalala, the Democrat from Florida who was Bill Clinton's Health and Human Services Secretary, and she was once the president of the University of Wisconsin system. She's now an elected member of Congress from Florida. It's her first term. And Pelosi put her on this oversight board despite the fact that she is still holding large amounts of stock in healthcare companies. But nevertheless, she and the other people include people who were appointed by Mitch McConnell, like Pat Toomey, the senator from Pennsylvania, a Republican congressperson named French Hill, and a former Elizabeth Warren advisor named Bharat Ramamurthy. So it's interesting that they are at least reviewing things and have noticed that this money has not been distributed. But the money that did go out under that PPP, the Payroll Protection Plan, that's a mess. Total amount of loans backed by the federal government and forgivable if you meet certain terms added up to $660 billion, and they ran out of money. At least 61 public and private companies have returned their loans, and I think today is the deadline for companies to do that without penalty. But one of the companies, Real Networks, what was that guy's name? Rob Glazer. They're one of the early developers of audio products that use the MP3 encoding. They qualified for almost $3 million on April 24th, and they've said they'll keep the loan and use it to bring back their workers this week. But the money that was largely intended for small businesses, including those owned by women and minorities, well, mostly they have not received the relief they need. Just 12% of owners who applied for the government-backed loans reported receiving what they asked for. Nearly half of all owners said they anticipated having to permanently close in the next 6 months. So that money is not really available to them. And we've told you about the woman who contacted us from Berkeley. She runs a physical therapy business. And she qualified for the loan. She had to dance through all kinds of hoops. But because her customers are afraid and her employees are afraid to reopen, because it's a high-touch situation, essentially the money is useless to her. So here is another misguided effort of the bailout money. Lee Fung at The Intercept today reporting that they're using money from the CARES Act to, as I would put it, rebuild the wrong stockpile. Now, Rick Bright told us about the shortage of PPE. Well, part of the money from the CARES Act authorized $850 million for the Coronavirus Emergency Supplemental Funding Program, a federal grant program to prepare law enforcement, correctional officers, and police for the crisis. Well, what does that mean? It means purchasing not PPE to keep people healthy, but riot gear and other tools for militarized policing. One group, a private security operation founded by Iraq War veterans, has won over $1.6 million in contracts to provide guards for COVID-19 screening security guard services. As if all those people who want to be tested are going to, I don't know, stage a riot or something like that. No, that's the armed protesters who populated these AstroTurf efforts that were set up and organized and funded by Tea Party types and gun rights individuals who think the NRA is too soft. Well, according to a report in The Guardian, published today, those who went to the protests may be spreading the virus hundreds of miles and across state lines. Cell phone location data suggests the demonstrators at these anti-lockdown protests are often traveling hundreds of miles to events, returning to all parts of their states and crossing into neighboring ones. So the data was released by the Committee to Protect Medicare, raises the prospect that the protests will play a role in spreading the epidemic to areas which have so far experienced relatively few infections. And while I don't like to wish that anybody would contract this virus or spread it, if you have to rank who, I'll stop. It's bad for karma. You know what I mean. You see these people openly inviting it, and it's hard not to have dark feelings. So Trump, over the weekend, tweeted support for people in Suffolk County, New York. There was another one of these protests against the stay-at-home order, and a reporter from News 12 Long Island, Kevin Vesey, he's been on the beat for 8 years now. He went to cover it. And from what we can tell, he was very neutral. He just invited people to make their comments. But at a certain point, the crowd seemed to turn on him. A woman screamed at him, "Why are you essential? Why?" A guy in a MAGA shirt followed him as VC repeatedly asked him to back away. And the guy said, "No, I got hydroxychloroquine. I'm fine." In another clip, protesters called VC disgusting, the enemy of the people. They chanted fake news, not essential. And then Trump weighed in. He said that these are great people and that, fake news, just comments of that ilk. So, interestingly, one of the organizers of the group, the Setauket Patriots, issued this statement. Kevin, that's the reporter, VC, "Our group would like to apologize on how you were treated. This wasn't a Trump event, but an Open Up New York rally, and we invited all Long Islanders to attend. We can tell you that the few who decided to harass you and try to prevent you from doing your job are not members or affiliated with the Setauket Patriots in any way, shape, or form." So here's what Trump tweeted on Friday night. "Fake news is not essential," all caps. He shared the video again on Saturday. "People can't get enough of this," he wrote. Great people. Okay, Don. And by the way, there was some pretty ugly tweets from Don Trump Jr. over the weekend. And I'm sorry, I just declined to report or comment on him. He's not worth it. That's where I'll leave it. So we are now learning that a group allied with the Republican Party and the Trump campaign has pledged $20 million, and they're going to recruit 50,000 poll watchers to find the non-existent voter fraud in the United States in the November election. And what I love is how they're going to deploy 50,000 people to polling sites. But we know that while some states are resisting, in large parts of the country, like California, there isn't going to be anybody at the polls to watch. California, the governor announced that every registered voter is going to receive a mail-in ballot. And it's yet to be determined if they will actually open the polling places anyway. But they're going to show up, and not much will be going on. I want to recommend for you a piece today published at Consortium News. Colleen Rowley is a woman I've talked to many times. I have great respect for her, a veteran of the FBI. She was a special agent in the Minneapolis office who tried to alert Washington to the so-called 20th hijacker. And she is an official whistleblower who, of course, has been critical of the 9/11 investigation and the whitewash that occurred. And she writes in a piece headlined, "Ghost of J. Edgar Haunts Flynn Investigation," referring to Hoover, the criminal leader of the FBI for 40-plus years. Anyway, she does a great job of dissecting the Mike Flynn prosecution. And she cites Scott Ritter, who was our guest for a podcast interview a week ago. If you haven't listened yet, please do. Because Scott Ritter changed my mind. Like many people, I looked at the details of the Flynn case that were public. And I said, even if it's trivial that he spoke to the Russian ambassador, why would he lie to the FBI agents who came to visit him when he knew that they had been able to intercept that call? So Rowley adds some interesting detail. She gives you background on the failure of the FBI to update its interview processes just to use a recording device on a cell phone. I've got one of these digital recorders, costs $45, records hours of voice. It's the size of a granola bar. And the FBI refuses to use recording systems to get verbatims relying on the handwritten notes of their agents, and then they translate those notes into what is called a 302 form. And she points out that Peter Strzok and his then-girlfriend, Lisa Page, they took the notes from it was Strzok and an agent named Joe Pientka who went to the White House to interview Flynn. And Pientka took the notes. Then Strzok and Page edited them without the participation, apparently, of Pientka. And so you know how it works when you get more and more removed from the original statements in an attempt to capture them. And Rowley suggests that they intentionally massaged the content in order to create the perception, the illusion, that Flynn was acting in a guilty manner. So I recommend that. Also, Scott Ritter has a follow-up piece at Consortium News where he goes into great detail, and if you want to see it for yourselves, the testimony under oath of Sean Henry, top executive at CrowdStrike. They're the ones who examined the DNC server and said, aha, it's Fancy Bear. This is a Russian job. That was relied upon for the CIA assessment published in early January of 2017, on which the media and the Democrats relied, saying, well, here is the evidence. But there wasn't any evidence. It was a series of weaselly worded assessments. And now we know that fundamentally, our government has no evidence that the DNC servers were broken into by Russian hackers. That is the keystone, if you will, of the whole Russiagate narrative, and it's fallen apart. But you're not seeing any updated reporting from Rachel Maddow. There's no self-examination by the New York Times as they did when Judy Miller took the bait and reported false claims of WMD in Iraq. The Times, later did correct itself. But there's no indication they're prepared to do that, at least not now. And here comes an op-ed from Evelyn Farkas into the Sunday Washington Post. She was a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia in the Obama administration 2012 to 2015. And now she's running for Congress in the 17th Congressional District in New York. I don't know exactly where that is. Anyway, she opens with this. In 2017, I cautioned that any candidate for office who was outspoken about Russia ought to worry about Russian interference in their election. At the time, I had no idea I would be one of those candidates. But this month, I saw my face plastered on a screen behind Fox News host Tucker Carlson as he made false statements about me. Then she kind of shifts here. U.S. national security experts warned years ago that Russia would meddle in our 2020 elections. The reality is worse. President Trump's supporters are mirroring Russian tactics. Now, look at the sleight of hand here. Because she suggests, and the headline flatly states, Russia is interfering in our elections again. But then she elides to say that Trump's supporters are mirroring Russian tactics. And she goes on to say what happened in 2017 and that the current campaign against her appears to be domestic, albeit aided by Russian trolls. Now think about this. Because she is trying to make the claim that Americans who support Trump and who attack her as one of the promoters of the now disproven Russiagate narrative are merely aided and abetted. Well, no, she doesn't say abet. Aided by Russian trolls. What if that's true? It's made in the United States. And Russia, you could, consider it rational for them to target her. And if they do indeed have these armies of bots, if they do, I think it's highly exaggerated. But she's trying to blow a lot of smoke here. She said, well, I sounded the alarm early regarding ties between Trump, his advisors, and Kremlin officials and cronies. During an interview on MSNBC in March of 17, I said I knew there was more to the story when media reports and statements and the intelligence community began unearthing connections between Trump's campaign and Russia. Almost all of those are dead ends. The Mueller report didn't prove any of these alleged connections. That Evelyn went on MSNBC and endured the tough interrogation from one of their hosts. and so this is how the corporate media continues to promote the fantasies, the conspiracy theories of Russian interference in 2016. And as I've always said, Russia tries to hack the U.S. every day. They use nefarious tactics in many ways to amplify the worst that America has to offer. But fundamentally, this stuff was made in America by Americans and blamed on Russians. And Glenn Greenwald's new video series, I started to watch over the weekend. It was pretty long. I got through an hour and then saw there's another 45 minutes to go. I'll try to get back to it. But he does a really good job of explaining the origins of the Flynn investigation, how distasteful he finds Mike Flynn personally, but that the tactics of the FBI and the role that the media has played in this are beyond deplorable. So I'll try to watch the rest of that over the next few days, and if I find anything else that you ought to know, I'll report it to you. And finally today, a couple of corrections. One is a simple one. On Friday, I'm embarrassed to say that I believed a representation of Rush Limbaugh. I was listening to him, and he said, I got this new report from Georgia. It shows that even after they opened the state, positive testing and infections and hospitalizations didn't go up. Well, as it turns out, they cooked the books. And they created graphs that were not linear by dateline. So they'd show a Monday in April and then a Thursday in April and then a Sunday in April. And they lined them up by the number of cases reported. And so it created the illusion that the pattern was steady to declining when the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and state officials who aren't supporting Brian Kemp got a hold of it. They said, wait a minute, this is bullshit. And I want to commend a friend of this program, Ian Berman. I mentioned him on Friday, that we had had a little discussion and disagreed on a Facebook thread about the impact of the temporary suspension of the elements in the 2017 tax law that put a cap on state and local taxes. And Ian went to great detail. He loaded up a spreadsheet. He offered me examples of different income levels, households of 150, 200,000, 500,000, a million, and 5 million. And doggone it, he lays out the figures that show that he's right, that the amount of tax increase when the deduction for state and local taxes is capped at $10,000 does disproportionately benefit people who earn more than $500,000 a year and own homes of $2.5 million. And even in California, that's a pretty nice house. So, Ian, I am not going to bluster or anything else. You are correct, and I thank you for taking the time to prepare all of this data to make your case. Now, I do stand by other comments that instead of this temporary suspension of one element of the odious 2017 tax law, in the so-called HEROES Act, the Democrats should be proposing full repeal of the 2017 tax cuts. And boy, that would get the attention in the Senate. And they would be negotiating and horse trading for other things that are valuable to people, and we'll just pick a number here, in households under $100,000 in income a year. And I also stand by my statement that the cap on it was punitive in nature, that it was intended to send a political message to Democratic states. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube. And I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.